where Jesus is saying to the Jewish leaders, you are from your father, comma, the devil. When you look at the Greek, ektu patras tu diavalu, you are from the father of the devil. The fact that Yahweh is trying to get his own particular people out of Egypt. He's trying to get them into the desert, into a mountain, where there will be a big storm on top of the mountain, and then Moses will stumble down with 2 stone blocks, saying that he is the words of Yahweh. When the Egyptians imagined all this happening, they thought that this was really a description of Set. And the Septuagint of the Exodus, that is the Exodus in Greek, they recognized that God of plagues and of deserts and of mountains and of blood and of war as Set, interpreted in their own way, to the effect that Jews worshipped Set, who is the god of evil. Yah-O, this sounded to Egyptians like A-O, and A-O is the equivalent of the donkey bray. Because when you learn about this god, it looks very different than the Platonic good, right? The Platonic good doesn't change and is unambiguously good and only does benefits for people.
And welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true Gnosis. And the great sage is back once again with another one. Dr. M. David Litwa. Links are in the description for the YouTube channel. That's free. You might as well hit that subscribe button. You're losing nothing. But also, if you want to support a great scholar, as I do, there's also the link for the Patreon as well in the description. Go check those out. He's got different tiers. It might be some tiers that suit you better. And if I'm not mistaken, you do offer your Patreon members additional options of learning languages. I'm not sure if that's, are you still open for that, or are you filled up?
Oh, definitely. Yep. Open for that. So yeah, there's all sorts of tiers. You can come on and learn a bit of Greek and Coptic from me. I've got a tier for answering questions. I've got a tier for getting all my scholarly articles and scholarly work. And yeah, I've got a tier where I can send you a book in the mail, or even, have dinner at some point. So yeah,
Nice.
check it out.
There you go. That's right down in the description. Hit that link and check those out. And the topic for today is something that really fascinates me for the last couple of years since I've been, reading into this stuff. And it's the topic of early Christianity and how they viewed the Old Testament God. Some of you might not realize this, but the earliest Christians that we know about didn't all agree on who the Old Testament God was, what his role was, and so there's a couple of groups that come to mind. We might talk about more groups as well. But Marcion is this early Christian writer who, if I'm not mistaken, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm just going to tell you what I think. It seems that he thought the Old Testament God was evil. There's some other these Christian groups that had similar views.
Well, I think before we get to Marcion, let's just take a step back and draw a bit of the context for this, because the context for this is really setting the stage for all the figures that we'll talk about. So first of all, Christianity wants to appear intellectual. It takes on all the intellectual repertoire of its time. And in its time, the dominant philosophy was Platonism. And so Christians, they didn't want to portray themselves as believing in fables and in conflicted and morally problematic depictions of God. They wanted God to be unchangeable, to be everlasting, to be full of wisdom, to be unknown, to be transcendent, to be hypercosmic, that is, transcending the world, and to, most importantly, be good, and to have no question about the fundamental goodness of God ever at any time. And so these are the fundamental traits of Platonism. Platonism and Christianity join forces, and they really never stopped joining forces, because even today, I mean, all Christians will insist that their God is good and only good and is somehow transcending this world. Those are not inherently biblical ideas. There's no point in where you'd be flipping through, the Bible, um, or say, the Hebrew Bible, and you'll find, God is transcendent. I mean, you'll never find that as a doctrine. Okay, that's Platonism that has been worked into Christianity like leaven. Okay, and has inflated the dough.
I want to
Sure.
just to add to what you say real quick, and then I want to continue with what your thought was. But I noticed this recently while I was looking at Wikipedia page for some of these high level bishops in Rome in the Roman Catholic Church, and it says I'm showing it on the screen as I say this: Roman Catholic, and then it says philosophy, Neoplatonist. So some of these Roman Catholics are like self-professed Neoplatonists in 2023 right now. Just to add, just wanted to throw that out there to add what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, you've had with Pope Benedict the 16th, he made an official statement on this, that Christianity and Platonism have joined hands, and have always been the two constituent elements in what became Christian theology. And in the second century, it's no different. So when you're a Platonist, the very first thing you do, in the most widely read and the most popular text ever in antiquity, it wasn't the Apology of Socrates, it wasn't the Phaedrus with its wonderful image of the, the soul as a chariot, it wasn't the Symposium where you have the drinking party and speeches about love. It was the Timaeus, which is Plato's creation story. And in that creation story, he distinguishes God as the good from the creator, who is a lower being, who is also good, because the creator is a perfect manifestation of the good. And the creator, also known as the demiurge, but it's the same word, demiurgos, just translates as creator. This creator creates the best of all possible worlds, which is our world, and does his best to conform our world to the good and to the eternal thoughts of God, the eternal forms, as Plato thought of them. So already Christians are dealing with a scenario in which there is not a split in the Godhead, but a distinction. That is, a distinction between the ultimate and transcendent God and God's manager. Okay, and God's manager is the creator. And in Platonism, there's no hint that the creator is bad. In fact, that would be quite wrong-headed. But there were in the universe, it wasn't just Christians, it was all people who acknowledged that the middle management class of deity, which is called the daimones, okay, or the daimons, these could be good or evil. And the daimones took control of the nations. And so each nation had its own daimon, its own sponsor, as it were. Sort of much more like I was going to say mascot, but much more than that. The daimon is the leading force and protector of that nation. And we see this idea back in Deuteronomy, where, that all the 70 nations of the world are given 70 different angels to be their manager. But the angel given to Israel is Yahweh himself. And later, the angel given to Israel is depicted as Michael. That's in the book of Daniel. But anyway, this idea of angelic rulers of the nations, or daimonic rulers of the nations, this is a fundamental idea. And they observed this because, when you went to different regions of the world, different cities or city-states would worship different deities. So Athens obviously has Athena as their daimonic protectress, and other city-states will have different different gods in charge. Obviously, in Egypt there's Isis and Osiris, and in Rome there is the Olympian Zeus, or the Capitoline Zeus, and you could go anywhere. And the way that Christians kind of thought of this is that the gods of the nations, they are real, but they represent these middle management level of deity, and not all of them are good. In fact, as Christians later concluded, none of them are good. Now, with this basic idea, some Christians who were not Jewish by lineage or by practice, that is, they didn't practice circumcision or kashrut or any of the other purity laws, they viewed the God of Judea, that is the nation of Judea, the nation of the Jews, in much the same way as they would have viewed the gods of Athens or of Rome or of Alexandria or what have you, that is, as a middle management being. And this particular middle management being, by the name of Yahweh, or as the Greeks said it, Yahweh, this God had that same ambiguity, because when you learn about this God, it looks very different than the Platonic good, right? The Platonic good doesn't change and is unambiguously good and only does benefits for people. He doesn't curse
And
anybody.
Plato says he can't be jealous.
He cannot be jealous.
It's a
Yeah.
specific thing in the Old Testament that he says, "I'm the jealous God." I always found that.
Yeah. So the famous line in Plato and from the Phaedrus is there is no jealousy in the divine choir. That is, no God, if it is a God, can be jealous, because the idea of a jealous God simply does not make logical and philosophical sense, because God needs nothing, therefore has no desire for anything else. If jealousy then is the desire for someone else's property or characteristic, then, QED, God cannot be jealous. Otherwise, if you say that God is jealous, you implicitly say that he needs something.
Wow.
But then that isn't God. That would be a lower middle management level of being who is jealous of the other nations, the other gods leading the other nations, Because when you think about it, Judea is a very small nation.
Right.
It always has been. And Israel today, I mean, it's not quite the size of New Jersey. I mean, it's a very small place.
Right.
So you can imagine a situation where the angels are competing with each other. And we see that again in the book of Daniel, where the archangel Michael, who's prince of Israel, is fighting with the prince of Persia. Well, who's the prince of Persia? Well, it's the angel in charge of Persia. They're jealous, and they have wars and fights. And when there's wars and fights today, like between Ukraine and Russia, the ancients would think of this as the angel of Russia versus the angel of Ukraine. And one angel is quite bigger and more arrogant than the other, and wants to pick on the other nation to gain more power. So these issues are sort of your bread and butter kind of philosophical interpretation of how to envision the world from a philosophical perspective. You view the gods as true beings, but on a middle management level. And the true God, who is the singular God, is outside of this world, above the gods, above the middle management level of the other beings called gods. And that God is perfectly good, unchanging, unjealous, unharmed by evil, not needing anything, etc., etc. So this is the intellectual presentation of there. This is how an intellectual in the ancient world, say in the 2nd century, would voice things. And so Marcion, who's one of these intellectuals, and we can include with Marcion the so-called Sethians, or the seed of Seth. We can include the Paradics. We can include several other groups. They have this Platonic idea of God, and then they read the Old Testament, and or what Christians today call the Old Testament. We'll just call it the Septuagint. when they read that document, they realize that the God in that document doesn't match the description of the good, because even this God, it gets jealous of Adam and Eve in the garden, it kicks them out, tries to prevent them from getting knowledge, creates a situation where it's almost impossible for them to win. So in that respect, introduces a large number of design flaws, is arbitrary in his rules, and when people don't obey his rules, he attempts to annihilate them in the flood. And when the city of Sodom and Gomorrah gets a little bit dirty, he'll firebomb it, send a nuclear bomb by the hand of an angel, blast it into smithereens, along with 5 other cities, or as the story goes, that the smoke still rises in the Dead Sea region. These cities were wiped off the map simply because Yahweh couldn't find anyone who worshipped him in those cities. And this image of God, is the God who sends wild she-bears against young children to eat them up because they make fun of Elisha because Elisha is bald. This is the kind of God that we're dealing with. It's the God who kind of plays with Israel a bit like a yo-yo, is like pulling them back and pushing them,
Right.
sending them in exile, promising to bring them back if they're good. But of course, they have to obey his regime of rules. And then, if they don't obey, he keeps threatening them and threatening them, and basically then, lets all hell run loose, and sends the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And it's like a game of cat and mouse. It's a very intolerant God, a very arbitrary God, somewhat unpredictable, emotional, and you can see this. I mean, even Jack Miles has a book called the God, a biography, and you can see this, that people without the kind of faith commitments are still willing to say that this is a highly arbitrary and dangerous individual that we call Yahweh. And so falls far short of any description of any kind of universal and absolutely good God. So they must not be the same character. And that's the fundamental deduction, right? And it's also, for a Platonist, it's not a surprising thing, because in the Platonism, you're expecting the structure of reality to be, you have God on top, and God is one, and you can call yourself a believer in one God, but of course then you believe in a creator who's the middle manager, and that structure of belief was very common. It's less common today because obviously in Orthodox theology they've so insisted that those two beings are the same,
Right.
but that wasn't the dominant model in antiquity, so that's really important to remember.
Wow, that's very fascinating. And then, so like you mentioned, these different sects of Christianity who sort of share this Platonic belief in this perfect creator, and then middle beings, and Yahweh being one of them. That explains that very well. So I guess we instead of getting into who Marcion was and what, I think we understand that Marcion sort of promoted some of these similar ideas. But I really want to touch on this idea of Yahweh possibly being tied to the Egyptian god Set. Because the reason, and I know it sounds like I'm going to a whole other topic, but you've tied this together very nicely in your book, The Evil Creator. By the way, I have a link for that in the description. So I think there's a good connection to be made here, because we have some sources, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, definitely. Well, as in with every other nation, you have gods who are in charge, and in Egypt the situation is usually the gods in charge are the beneficent gods Isis and Osiris, but the Egyptians also recognized that there was a god of foreigners in their midst, and a god of evil associated with red and blood and the dryness of the desert mountains and storms. And that's the god they called Seth, which the Greeks identified with Typhon. So sometimes you'll see this hyphenated name, Set Typhon. That's just the Greeks trying to understand who this god is. So, I mean, for thousands of years before Christianity, Set was viewed as this particular type of god. And when the Jews got around to promoting the Septuagint version of Exodus, they said that, yeah, Yahweh was at one time attacked Egypt in a series of 10, we call them plagues, but they are 10 separate attacks on the Egyptian people. And they look a lot like the things that Set would do, that is, turning water into blood. There you get that red color. The idea of death and dryness, well, that's something that you get. Also darkness. And the fact that Yahweh is trying to get his own particular people out of Egypt, his people, foreigners, and Yahweh is the foreign god in Egypt. He's trying to get them into the desert, into a mountain, where there will be a big storm on top of the mountain, and then Moses will stumble down with 2 stone blocks, saying that he has the words of Yahweh. When the Egyptians thought of or imagined all this happening, they thought that this was really a description of Set, right?
And if I'm not mistaken, not to cut you off, because this is amazing, brilliant stuff. If I'm not mistaken, the Hyksos, who Josephus and Manetho or Berosus, one of the two, connect with the Israelites, and you can even get scholars today on the apologetic side connecting the Hyksos with the Israelites. Whether that's true or not, regardless of the fact is, the Hyksos, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, their god was Set.
Well, so that's in the later Greek retellings.
Okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't call that a native Egyptian tradition. I mean, the irony about Set is that he's everyone recognizes him as an Egyptian god, and the Egyptians recognize him as that, but he is also the god of foreigners. So he's sort of, I mean, that's why he's a threat. That's why he's the enemy of Osiris, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, the long and short of it is, when the Septuagint of the Exodus, that is the Exodus in Greek, became widely known in Egypt, they recognized that god of plagues and of deserts and of mountains and of blood and of war as Set. And that, so it was natural for them to see Yahweh as Set, or as a form of Set. And they agreed with the Jewish mythology, and then sort of, interpreted it in their own way, to the effect that Jews worshipped Set, who is the god of evil and a god associated with donkeys, which is why they took special interest in Moses and donkeys, and there are episodes where Moses deals with donkeys, and so that they made that connection as well. And they also made the connection because Yahweh's name in ancient Greek was pronounced Yah-O. This sounded to Egyptians like A-O, and A-O is the equivalent of the donkey bray. So we in English, we say hee-haw, but the Egyptians said E-O, and when they heard the sound of Yahweh in Greek, Yah-O,
It almost sounds like a Bacchic cry too.
Well, that's Evi, yeah, it's a bit different. Yeah.
Isn't there a Yaki? Isn't that another one too? Or is it
Yaki? Yep.
well, okay, it's still a different word though. Still a different word. I got you.
Yeah, to get the hard K sound.
Yeah.
Basically, there were a number of reasons for native Egyptians to make the connection between the Jewish deity and Yahweh. And so before Christianity, the Jews were already under attack from native Egyptian revisionary mythology. And so, as you can imagine, when Christianity came to maturity in Egypt, which I believe was the early 2nd century, with intellectuals like Basilides and Carpocrates and Valentinus, they had no love or loyalty to Judaism, and they more or less, not Valentinus or Carpocrates, but other figures like Sethians, perhaps, if they made it to Egypt, or if they were in Egypt, they were attracted to this idea of Set as a form of Yahweh, or Yahweh as a form of Set. And this explained for them a lot of things. It explained why Yahweh was so violent. I mean, this is the God who kills the firstborn.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a child-killing murderer.
And I just to look into, I was looking at Tacitus because I knew he said something on this. I just couldn't remember what it was, and I was able to pull it up. And he does say that there's rumors that when the Israelites were in the desert, they were starving, and on the 7th day, donkeys led them to salvation. And now, because of that, they worship the image of the donkey. So this is in Tacitus in the 2nd century, right around the time when all these different groups are popping up that we're talking about. So you got to wonder if this was kind of a thing in the air at the time.
Exactly. So I reconstruct this whole story in the stemma of the traditions in my book, The Evil Creator, which I know it's pricey. That's due to Oxford University Press. But yeah, you can hop on Patreon, and I can try to get you a deal there. And hopefully, the Kindle version is not too bad. And hopefully we'll get a paperback soon. But yeah, don't hesitate to hop on Patreon. I give a deal to Patreon members for books, and especially if you join the certain tier, I'll send it to you for free, signed in the mail. So at any rate, yeah, get the word out. The Evil Creator, newsflash, he's been here the whole time. He's been here for long, even before Christianity even appeared.
So, the final question on this topic, because this is fascinating. You got these groups, for example, one of them being the Cainites. Cainites. Isn't Cain one of the bad guys? Well, Cain was a tiller of the ground. And some of these Pythagorean Platonists were vegetarians. And you add that to what we just mentioned with all these rumors floating around about Yahweh being Set or him possibly not being perfect. You have to wonder, Cainites, Marcionites, Sethianites, these are people who are looking at this from a Platonic worldview. And yeah, what else? And so last time I'm gonna ask you, the Sethians, is their name tied to this, or is this just a coincidence?
Yeah, well, Sethians are named for the third son of Adam, who emerges after the death of Abel. And this son Set is said to be to continue the image of his father Adam, which is the image of God, and to be called the spermaheteron, which is the distinct or different seed. And many, yeah, apparently think that this was a sort of pre-incarnation version of Jesus, or of the being who was later incarnate in Jesus. But anyway, Seth is this savior figure who emerges early, and carries on the secret mystical traditions that were known even before Judaism, but lost. And so Judaism is a sort of, it comes in and it is the religion of the God Yahweh. But actually, Seth, long before Abraham, had the true traditions. And then these true traditions reemerged later when Seth became incarnate in Jesus.
I see what they're doing there. That's very fascinating how they take the tradition and sort of just say, "Oh wait, what about this brother? Well, we're from him, so we got the real line of succession going." And it's kind of interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, it's certainly anti-Jewish, but in a sense, not any more anti-Jewish than other forms of Christianity
Sure.
were. So if you look at the Epistle of Barnabas, um, this is a letter that still it looks um, orthodox, basically, but it says that it was an evil angel, angelos poneros in the Greek, that tricked. The Greek is a sophism, tricked the Israelites, literally tricked them into using physical circumcision. The physical circumcision, the cutting of the penis, was never intended by God. It's a silly, silly ritual.
Wow.
And they were actually tricked by an evil angel. And then the whole question is, well, who's that evil angel? And there's, among Orthodox interpreters, this overwhelming sense that, well, that just must be another name for Satan, right? I mean, but when you look back in Genesis 17, the only being who demands circumcision is Yahweh. That's the evil angel.
Wow. Wait, and now I have an additional question that just popped in my head now, because you have in the Gospel of Mark Jesus telling the Pharisees and Sadducees that their father is the devil. Now we've talked about this in my channel, but there might be some
Gospel of
people
John.
watching.
Yep.
Gospel of John. I'm sorry,
Yep.
but someone watching who don't know this yet. So can you reiterate this phrase and what you think this means, and maybe what you think that early Christians like Marcion, like the Sethians, would have interpreted this as?
Well, Marcion, I mean, he might have liked and enjoyed John, but he didn't view it as scripture. Where John appears is in other kinds of literature, among the Paradics and among the Archontics. And the verse in question here is if my memory serves, is John 8:48, and it's in English translated, or I think mistranslated, as you, where Jesus is saying to the Jewish leaders, "You are from your father, comma, the devil," which is a horrible thing to say. But when you look at the Greek, it's humes ectu patras tu diavalu, which is better translated, "You are from the father of the devil." And
Wow.
who's the devil's father? Well, I mean, we all ultimately have one origin, and even the devil is a fallen angel. He didn't come out of nothing. His father, his generator, is still God, in this case, the Jewish creator. And it just so happened that the Jewish creator made a mistake. He fathered a bunch of these angels, and a lot of them rebelled against their father because they couldn't stand him, and became devils. And this has ever since become a core Christian myth. The origin of Satan. Satan is originally an offspring of the Creator, but turns against the Creator for whatever reason. There's lots of reasons, but he turns against the Creator, and so even the devil's father is still Yahweh. So when Jesus says, "You are from the father of the devil," he's saying something which is actually not controversial at all. He's saying that the Jews are from Yahweh, and then when you go read the verse, it gets horrifying, because it's not only "you are from the father of the devil," it's "you do the deeds that he did," and he's a liar and a murderer from the very beginning.
Wow. And so, to end this, do you think that Paul's epistles reflect that attitude of there being some sort of different, or do you think Paul is more or less saying that God is the Father, is perfect, and Jesus is the Son? What is your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, so Paul has been domesticated for nearly 2,000 years, and the attempt to make him sound good it continues today. But yeah, there are passages in Paul which make you wonder. He has in Galatians 3:19, it says the law was given through angels. So the law is not a direct product of God, and
Wow.
it's angels who are administering that. Um, and so not that means that not every law is good, and not every law is permanent either. So you can throw it out, and that allows him to make that move.
Yeah, that's one thing you
Um,
can say for certain about Paul is he has this idea that the law is bondage and freedom is in Christ, and you don't need the law anymore because you're saved, because you're circumcised in the heart, not in the flesh.
yes, that's the Paul after 20 years of reflection on why he became a follower of Jesus the Messiah. Paul the Jew, presumably, you know, before 20 years before he wrote that letter, would never say anything like that about Judaism. I mean, Jews even today view the law as a gift. It's not a burden at all, and it's something good, something to have joy in. So that's the Simcha Torah. They have festivals just out of joy for God giving the law. But of course, Christians have it all the opposite way. They want to say, "Oh my God, the law is such a burden." It's the most awful thing that could ever happen to you. Excuse me, but this has to do with you know prevarication after you've already converted to a particular view and framework. Um, it's our meta narratives that determine how we view things. But getting back to Paul, yes, he also says in 2 Corinthians 4:4 that the God of this world, hatheos to aionos, etiflosin, that is blinded people from seeing the light of the glory of Christ. And I don't know if the Father of Jesus Christ ever really trying to blind people from seeing the light of His Son. So whoever that God is doesn't seem to be the Father. That would have to be someone different. And then again, you pull the Orthodox trump card and say, well, that has to be Satan. Well, the same thing that we saw in Barnabas, we see in Paul. Paul never calls Satan a god. And it would be presumptuous to say that Satan is the god of the whole world. No, that's a perfect description of the Creator. And in fact, we find that very term, God of the world, describing Yahweh in books of the Septuagint. So, to my mind, that's a reference to the Creator, and that documentably is how Marcion took it.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, if it's 1 Corinthians 8 where he actually acknowledges that there are other gods, or is that also um translation debated type of thing?
Well, he says there are many gods and many lords. Yeah.
Now, is that something people debate on? Is he actually saying there's other gods, or do people say no? He's not saying that these gods are real. He's just saying people worship them. What do you think?
Well, of course, in Orthodox theology, it's not permitted for Paul to say that there really are literally other gods,
Right,
because then you'd have to give up on the idea that he was a monotheist.
right.
But of course, that is a rather plain reading of the text.
I agree.
I mean, of course, Paul himself would want to say that these other beings called gods are really daimones.
Right. It would fit. It would fit with the times, with the Middle Platonists of the time period.
Yeah, and that's exactly how an intellectual would think, that they are very real beings, but they're the middle management level.
Wow, that brought it right back to the full circle. That was perfect. Yeah. Anything else you want to touch on with this subject before we close out?
No, just yeah, check out the books. I've got an Amazon page as well. So yeah, don't hesitate to contact me over Patreon. Unfortunately, I can't take the emails just because I get floods and floods of emails a day, and it just becomes overwhelming. So catch me over Patreon, and I will see you there.
And I have links for your YouTube, your Patreon, and the book Evil Creator, because we talk about that a lot. So that featured book is in the description as well. And you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.